Good morning. This is Neil Buchanan with Rock Our World. Yesterday I did 4 episodes in a row, and I just watched them all, and I picked up a few loose ends that I missed, I think, in all of them. Just some ideas and thoughts I would add. And so I'll use my goofy glasses here once in a while, just see what I wrote down. Um, Poor old eyes are at 62, they've done real well, but when I get within a couple feet, I don't. It gets a little fuzzy. Everything past 2 feet is quite clear. Anyway, I was talking about dietary laws and the idea of kosher. That idea does not exist. There's no such thing as kosher or dietary laws. Those are human ideas. God simply gives us instructions, and He doesn't categorize them. He just gives a variety of instructions. Humans categorize things, which has some usefulness. It's just that we get carried away, and then we start imagining things. And actually, I just thought of another thing as I'm speaking on the list of meats that the Lord gave us. The kosher idea and the system the Jewish people developed, and then you get to the point where you think it actually is a rule that God made, but one that has come to mind many times is they have very strict ways of slaughtering cattle, which are good. I mean, it's not cattle, like any clean well, clean isn't the right word either. I got to do a teaching on clean and unclean are English words that are not counterparts of the Hebrew. We actually have no Hebrew or English counterpart. I've been asking the Lord about this forever and ever, and He gave me it was 12 words. I wrote it down somewhere, and I'll give a teaching on this. The equivalent of unclean takes 12 English words to describe it properly, and it is not what's conveyed by the idea of clean and unclean. It has a lot more to do with kind of a ceremonial state, and for the most part, when we say we eat a piece of pig without realizing it or without knowledge, which most Christians are in that boat. They're not guilty because they don't know, but it only makes us ceremonially disqualified for a short period of time until sunset. That's generally a lot of the kind of like a penalty, you might say. No, penalty is not right either, because there's some things that just aren't penalties. They're just the way God said to do it. Anyway, I will get back to that before I get too far down this rabbit trail trying to get back where I intended to go. I thought of this, how there's a lot of rules that were made up on how to slaughter animals in a kind and humane way, those are very good teachings, but they're not God's rules. They're common sense based on God's rules of compassion and kindness, and animals they're far above a plant. They do have personalities, and they do have sort of like feelings. They're very similar to humans in a lot of ways. Just a very lower, I don't know if you call it lower level of intelligence. In some ways, they're more intelligent than us, but they teach us things, and they're just like a dog, is kind and forgiving and so faithful, and so, man, those Akitas we used to have, they would die to protect us, and yet for the most part it looks like they're just laying there sleeping. Anyway, back to these animals. God makes it very clear that we can eat deer-like animals, wild animals, like here in Saskatchewan we have white-tailed deer, and we call them jumpers. It's a different kind of deer, and there's all kinds of animals like that are wild, but we can eat them. Well, you can't go walk up to a wild animal and calm it down and talk to it nice and scratch its head and slit its throat. Like, that's the idea of humane slaughter. You just can't do that because they're wild. They're scared of you. So anyway, we make a bunch of rules, and then we keep them long enough, and we get the impression, well, God said to do this, and then that's what we teach our children, and they pass that along for generations, and then Well, that's what God says. But he never did say that. So anyway, that was a long rabbit trail. And back to there was one fourth law. I said there was three that might be considered dietary, even though God did not call them dietary. And that was cooking a kid in its mother's milk. And the Orthodox Jewish people have developed that one line into an elaborate set of rules to separate, I think, dairy from meat, I think is what it is. But God never said any of that stuff. And I'm talking about Jesus Christ here. He's the one that made these, well, passed them along from the Father, but he gave them to Moses, and actually he gave them to he gave them to Adam, he gave them to, Noah and Abraham, and all of those people kept these instructions before Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai wasn't the beginning of the giving of the Torah. Torah always existed even before humans were made. In the Book of Jubilees, the angels is written from the perspective of the angels. They said they kept all these things probably for millions of years before God made Adam and Eve. And that's speaking in our idea of time. God created time, you might say, so that our physical minds could grasp our existence of ourselves. Anyway, I'm getting too far off on different things, but the thing about cooking a kid or a little goat, a baby goat in its own mother's milk is all about compassion, and it's obvious. Is God wants us to develop compassion, and 99% of all people would look at that instruction and say, well, that's horrible. That's just the most horrible thing you could imagine to do. And it's all about be compassionate in everything that you do towards people, towards animals, towards the entire creation that God made, which is beautiful and functions in millions of different ways that he created, that we just monkey with it and we wreck it and we pour all these chemicals into it, we pour sewage into it, we're a bunch of, I would say idiots, but I'm not supposed to say that, so whatever your equivalent to that in a nice way, that's what we are. We don't use common sense, and we don't think things through, and we are completely selfish. We don't seem to care about the consequences of our actions, how they'll affect anybody else. Nonetheless, that's all that instruction meant, and it was very likely something that the pagan people, or the goyim, the people that were separated from God already when they came into the land of Canaan, God said these people have sunken to the depths of depravity, and they've defiled the land, and they did those kind of things, and that was very likely a very common practice amongst these heathen people, that they had drifted so far from God for so many generations that they had a horrible society, and God asked his people to wipe them out. And just makes you think of the commandment to, we think it says do not kill. It doesn't say that. It says do not murder. Murder means you know someone, you develop hatred towards them, and you nurture that hatred, and then the final act of this nurturing of hatred, you kill them. That's what God's talking about. That's the commandment, not to do that. As far as killing, if somebody's about to kill your wife or your children, you rise up and you kill him first. And of course, defend yourself, because you need to be there to be the defender of your children and your wife, and then your community and your country. My dad went to war in World War II. He signed up, and I'm proud of him for that. He did his patriotic duty, and he was following the instructions of the Lord in doing so, because we helped defend the free world against the horrible things that Hitler attempted to do, and we were the victors. And Canadians have a very big role in World War II. we can be very, well, pride is not the right word. We can be very pleased with what our forefathers did, and I'm really proud of my dad. He did his part, and anyway, I'm getting too far afield here again. Back to I even forgot where I was. With the extra rule there: don't kill don't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk. There's not, God doesn't disallow us from eating a baby goat or the milk, but the act of cooking the goat in its own mother's milk is a horrible, horrendous idea that has a complete, total lack of compassion in it, and God is saying, don't do those kind of things. There's actually another rule I wanted to just briefly touch on. Don't kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. And I often wondered when I'd read that, what would that mean? Because God doesn't want us to freeze. Like up in Saskatchewan here, if we didn't get the heat going in the middle of winter, we'd probably be dead by the time Sabbath was over. And it didn't, one of his other instructions is make the Sabbath a delight. So they didn't seem to work together very well. Anyway, I knew it didn't mean what it appears to mean right on the surface. It means something else. It's a deeper meaning. What it means is you don't let the old fire go out. So I mean, that's simple. It says it right in there, but if you don't think logic, I mean, if you think legalistically, you can't see the obvious meaning. Don't let the old fire go out. That covers the basis. You're not kindling a new fire. That's what it's talking about. You don't start a new fire on the Sabbath day. You keep the old fire going. And the meaning of that is the same reason that the Lord instructed the priests never to let the fire go out in the temple. You always keep the old fire going. You never, ever, ever let it go out. And that was continuous in the temple. But for humans in our homes, it's just the Sabbath day. You don't let it go out. But the ultimate meaning comes back to the first love that God stirs up inside of us, that we're not to let that fire die. We're not to let the first love die. And as humans, we have a lot of trouble doing that. I've been a believer for 42 years now, and when I had my real conversion, I mean, I went to church for 18 years, but I didn't glean too much. Anyway, for 42 years, there's times where my first love would sunk a little bit. I always, I don't think I ever would be classified as the backslidden Christian, but there was times where I didn't I didn't study a lot or pray a lot. I always did a little. And then there was times when you're really focused on some physical project and getting up in the morning, skip the prayer and study part. And anyway, fortunately, the Worldwide Church of God, that legalistic idea, you make sure you study the Word for a half an hour and you pray for a half an hour. That never did leave me. I mean, I didn't keep those numbers up all the time, but it was always in the back of my mind. Now, Neil, you just make sure you keep at this. Anyway, you know what I mean. There are ups and downs, but the Lord is always urging us to never let that first love die. Keep it rekindled. And again, rekindle doesn't mean start a new fire. It means add some fuel to the fire that's beginning to get weak. That's rekindle, not kindle, but rekindle. So anyway, enough of that teaching on why we're not to light a new fire on the Sabbath day. We're to keep the old fire going. And this short segment is starting to get long. I'm at 14 minutes here. I might end up having to make it into two. Let's see, put my goofy glasses on here. The thing about traditions, the Messianics have made a huge mistake. They latched on to the idea that we're supposed to follow God's instructions, which is exactly right. There's about 600 of them. But they made the classic mistake that the Worldwide Church of God also made before them. They went to the Jewish people to inquire of them how we're supposed to do these things. And God never ever told us to do that. What he told us to do, and if we just read our scriptures, we would know this, we're supposed to go to him and what he wrote. So what you do is you go and you start at Genesis and you read right through to, in our edition, it would be Malachi. In the Jewish edition, it's a little different arrangement, but same books. And like I've encouraged you before, once you do that a few times, then get yourself a book of Enoch and a book of Jubilees and a book of Jasher. And there's another one that Abraham wrote, I think is legitimate. At any rate, you read all that stuff and you keep asking the Holy Spirit to teach you what it means. And then it doesn't take very long at all. And in these last days, and we are in the last days, absolutely, my opinion. It won't take very long at all, and you'll start to understand these things. It's supernatural, and God is speeding these things up. It won't take you 42 years like it took me. The Lord was very patient with me. I was a slow learner, and he's going to speed this stuff up. It'll be months. You'll start to see things very, very clearly. The Jewish people, they believe they should follow the ways of the Lord, but they've taken these more than 2,000 years, several thousand years to add stuff and add stuff and add stuff. And we don't want any of that stuff. We don't want any of that tradition. And eventually God's going to correct the Jewish people and say, okay, now throw away all that stuff I didn't say. Let's just stick to the stuff I did say. And for Christians, it's how about you bump up, the 10 or 8 commandments that you actually do keep. Let's bump it up to 600. And we'll straighten all these things out, quite quickly. So we do not go to the Jewish people and ask them about their traditions. That God did not give them to the. And now let's go back. Christians, we have lots of traditions. And I want to talk a little bit about this. I guess this is getting to be a long session. The word that we switched out in Christianity, they switched out Passover, the idea of the Passover, which is one of the Lord's required and instructed instructions. That's one of the festivals we're to keep every year. We switched that out for Easter. Now, Easter is the name of a demon. I referred earlier to Elijah's confrontation, the big showdown. I had never read this before. I read it before, but I wasn't cognizant that it was there. The confrontation was with 450 prophets of Easter, and in a lot of your translations it might say Ashtoreth or something like that, but it's the same thing. It's Easter. What we call Easter is that demon, and much like the prophets of Baal, the demon Baal, the demon Easter, the demon Moloch, and this is going to be a tough one. Bible is the name of a demon. And most people, if they research, I'm getting 2 thoughts going here, but I'll finish this one on Bible. If you research the word Bible, it'll tell you that means book. And it'll go back in history to where it all came from. It was a town on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and in ancient times in history, they traded in their big trading post or center for papyrus, which was the material used for writing on. So in other words, what we'd call paper. And then it eventually learned how to make books, and all these ideas were put together. So essentially, Bible is supposed to mean book, but the truth is that the town or the city was named by Biblia, or some form of Bible, and the temple in town which had a god in it and a statue and all the temple worship and everything surrounding any kind of a man-made god, had a demon behind it. And Paul talked about that. He says a statue is nothing, but there's always a demon that crawls up on top of that statue and accepts all the worship and all the praise. And so that's the problem we have when we build statues. And I don't want to point out the poor old Catholics get a rough time about this, but the truth is, Paul explained this whole thing. If there's a statue and people give reverence and respect to a statue, there's a demon crawls up there, a very powerful one, and starts accepting it, and that demon starts creating phenomena, to capture people that come along. Like real stuff happens. That demon can make that statue do all kinds of things and start infesting, I guess that's a good word, infesting the humans that give respect to it. Anyway, it's a whole play of stuff going on because we can't see demons and we're not taught about them, and we just assume they don't exist or they're nothing. They're doing all this stuff and we don't realize it. And so Paul explained how the statue itself is nothing. It's just a rock or a piece of wood or whatever, but there's a demon crawls up on top of it and accepts the worship. And then Paul goes ahead and said, but the demon that accepts the worship is something, and we're not to deal with statues. That's why we're not supposed to do that stuff, because the demons are ready there to take advantage of it and then get into our lives. They get a inroad into our lives and they mess with us, and they completely. That's why the big thing was made and has been made about Mary worship. Like, Mary is not to be worshipped. She's a wonderful lady in history, and she has a wonderful reward for all of eternity. She was a good lady along with many other good ladies, but we're not to worship her. At any rate, enough of that stuff. I started all this with Easter and Bible, so I'm back to Easter. So we got to get rid of that word. We do not celebrate Easter. We are to celebrate the Passover, and we're to celebrate it on the day that God says to do it, which is the 14th day of the first month of the year. And you find the first month of the year, the first day of the first month is the day after the spring equinox. Enoch explains all this. It's very simple, and the Christian world and the Jewish world both have to acknowledge that their calendars are wrong, and they got a whole bunch of pagan stuff mixed in with their religions, and we got to clean all this stuff up. It's going to be tough, lots of paradigms, but the people that are willing to follow the Lord, they're getting restless. We noticed that we went to the Feast of Tabernacles, or Shacks, I call it, the Feast of Shacks, down in Gary, South Dakota, and lots of good stuff was going on there. But the lay people who are studying their Bibles are getting restless, because the people in authority within the Christian and Jewish overall community, the top levels worldwide, they've been inherited lies from their fathers. So then they're passing along lies. For the most part, they don't realize they're lies, but if they just read their scriptures, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, they would know they're lies. And anyway, the lay people are reading, they're getting restless, they're saying, hey, how come we don't keep the New Moon Festival? And I had that question 30 years ago, and the Lord finally answered that question, and you'll find it in the 3 episodes on the New Moon Festival. At any rate, down in Gary, this was a big kerfluffle. The people are getting not just restless, they're saying, hey, there is something wrong here. Explain to us why we're not keeping the New Moon Festival, why our calendar is wrong. The moon is presenting itself on the wrong days, like the new moon that few days before the feast was 2 days off of the calendars that the rabbis set probably centuries ago. Anyway, God never told us to do it that way. He gave us the calendar. He gave us any person that once they're taught how to read the signs in the sky. The sun and the moon tell us exactly when to keep all the festivals, all the new moons, all the Sabbath days, everything. You don't have to go through the authorities. So God is correcting all this, and it's going to be tough for most believers, but there's going to be 10% that just go with it, and they humble themselves and they become broken before the Lord, before the rock, and then they won't be crushed to dust when the rock falls on them, which is a clear reference to the last days which have begun. So signing off, Neil Buchanan with Rock Our World, Daniel 2.